Welcome to the Hoover Institution. Welcome to the Schultz Auditorium. Welcome to this conference that we're holding here on decadence or renewal, about how to envision competence in American government. The basic idea here is that there is a nonpartisan and bipartisan agenda that has to do with how well America is governed, regardless of what it is you want the government to do. It is a premise of this conference that a major part of the erosion of trust and free government across the entire developed world is a consequence of the sense that government just doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well even in doing the things we agree it should do. And that somehow we need more powerful leaders, leaders who can strip away all the pettifogging procedures and get stuff done, because ordinary government in a pluralistic society can't. It is ironic that this feeling should be so salient in the United States of America, since not so long ago, the United States of America was regarded by the whole world as the paragon that proved democratic government could get stuff done. In the middle of the 20th century, I think it is no exaggeration to say that the United States of America and its officials was generally regarded across the world as the most competent government in the world. That is, when it came to can-do spirit and get stuff done, whether it was the largest arsenal of democracy in the world, whether it was feeding millions of people who were hungry, whether it was building atomic bombs, launching gigantic amphibious invasions, building airfields just about anywhere you could imagine them, and several places you couldn't, launching Berlin airlifts and Marshall Plans, highways, railroads, universities. It did look like the United States could get stuff done. There was this sense that, oh, the Americans aren't so ideological. They're a very pragmatic, can-do sort of people. I think it's fair to say this is not our worldwide reputation today. And it's that gap that's the subject of this framing panel, where we've got this magnificent group of historians to help us kick off that discussion. The first of them that you'll hear from is Mark Dunkelman. Mark is a senior fellow at the Searchlight Institute. He's a fellow of Brown University's Watson School of International and Public Affairs, and he's a senior fellow at NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management. He's worked for more than a decade for Democratic members in the Congress in both the Senate and the House side. He's worked at the Clinton Foundation, so he's approached the problems of government from a number of perspectives, inside and out. Joining us then is David Kennedy. David's very well known to people here at Stanford. In fact, he comes here having done a lecture for the Stanford Historical Society, having been at Stanford off and on since the time America had that can-do reputation. It's interesting how the history of Stanford University itself, in a weird way, kind of dovetails the rise of this reputation and its persistence today in the tech world. If you think about when Stanford really took off as a top-tier university in the late 1950s and early 1960s, very much as a spillover of the defense and aerospace revolution that America was leading. And David's been in a good position to watch all of that. As a historian, as a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, his work is chronicled, and for many people is still the standard work on much of the first half of what people called the American century. Jennifer Burns has looked at this from yet another perspective. Jennifer is a professor of history here at Stanford. She's also affiliated with the Hoover Institution. She's approached this as a student of American society and American history generally, but using the life and times of a couple of key thought leaders as a way of illuminating all the great issues about the scope of government. Her biography of Ayn Rand, followed more recently by her prize-winning biography of Milton Friedman, and his life and times have obviously given her a certain perspective on what a lot of different people thought government should do. So we'll start with hearing first from Mark, then David, then Jennifer. Then we'll talk a little bit here on the stage, then open the floor to your questions. Mark?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here. I'd like to open it up by arguing, just as a framing device for our conversation today, that rather than think about American history through the lens of whether we move right or left, we should view history through a tension between two different ideas which are both indelibly American and that span across the ideological spectrum. The first is what I call a Hamiltonian impulse. A Hamiltonian impulse, as you can tell, derived largely from Alexander Hamilton, is born from a notion that we all have, that in certain situations we face what would be called a tragedy of the common. The notion is that we find some sort of challenge in our community, in our lives, that we ourselves cannot solve alone. We don't have a sewer system, we don't have a good transit system, we don't have a functioning school. And we need to collectively take the power that we hold individually and invest it in some institution above us that will solve that problem for us, build the sewer, erect the school, what have you. That was Alexander Hamilton's vision when he, in the early days of the Republic, argued for essentially a very powerful centralized government, believing that America was a Hercules in the cradle, and that to harness the potential of the American dream, we would need to have centralized authority that could make big decisions quickly. At the same time, as everyone who has seen Hamilton knows, there's a different American tradition, which I call the Jeffersonian tradition. The Jeffersonian tradition, derived from Thomas Jefferson, is born from the notion that the problems in American life aren't born from a lack of centralized authority, but they stem from centralized authority itself. A fear that some powerful institution above us is imposing its views on ordinary people who should be able to make those decisions on their own. And throughout American history, the cry of freedom comes from this notion that we are being oppressed by, whether it was the monarchy in the early days, to some other form, whether it was Jim Crow laws. So you can run through the list of oppressive forces that exist in American society, and that throughout our history we've had to balance the impulse, in some cases, to push power up, as Hamilton had wanted to do, or to push power down, as Jefferson wanted to do. And these two impulses span across the political spectrum. The narrative, I think, of the last 125 years is that at the outset of the Industrial Revolution, we looked at the disruption brought by the railroads primarily, but then by industrial trusts. And there was a fight within the progressives, but across the political spectrum, about what to do about it. And one view was a Brandesian view born from the Jeffersonian tradition, which was that we should break up the big businesses and keep things small so that people were able to live the 19th century dream that they had had. And the other was born actually more from Felix Frankfurter and stemmed from the Hamiltonian solution, which was to push power in and up into big institutions that could do big things. At the outset, the Hamiltonian tradition really prevailed. And you can see that, and we'll, I'm sure, explore this later, probably most iconically with the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority, born in the early 1930s, was derived because the big utilities in the Upper South had refused, because it didn't make sense for them economically, to string wires to the poor farmers who lived in the Tennessee Valley. And Roosevelt, in the early days of administration, determined that he was going to fix this. So he invested authority in a Tennessee Valley Authority run by essentially a single lawyer named David Lilienthal, who made massive changes across that valley, stringing wires, reforesting whole hillsides, building dams, and had almost no person who could stand up to his authority. He could make those decisions centrally. And that became the iconic sort of, for many in government, the iconic original institution to Philip's litany of institutions that could do big things. The TVA was the Marshall Plan was a TVA for Europe. And in all sorts of different circumstances, that was the model that we would use. We would take a Hamiltonian solution to a big problem by investing power in a centralized authority. Then we realized in the late 60s and the early 70s that some of these Hamiltonian solutions were less beneficial, if not corrupt and antithetical to the American ideal. We saw in the Vietnam War, in the urban renewal program, in a whole series of different challenges, that centralized authority in many cases was not the benign instrument that David Lilienthal had tried to wield in the Tennessee Valley, was in fact nefarious. And so the Jeffersonian impulse, which had been sort of brushed aside during many of those early decades, takes a new purchase in American life. And there are a whole series of efforts over the course of the last 50 years to put checks on that centralized authority, in the sense that we don't want another Robert Moses, to borrow from Robert Caro's The Power Broker. We don't want Robert Moses running around America. And there was legitimate criticism of the old Hamiltonian system, and a need to correct for the abuses of the apex of Hamiltonianism during the New Deal and Great Society. But we've now come to the point where the Biden administration invested $7.5 billion in a new program to build electric vehicle chargers across the country in places where there aren't electric vehicle chargers. And at the end, as he left the administration, he built 58. Simply not a competent government. And as you look more deeply into why that is, it's not because there wasn't a David Lilienthal appointed to run that program. It's that over the course of the last 50 years, we've inserted so many checks, so many Jeffersonian checks into the system, that nobody, no matter how gallingly audacious as Robert Moses was, has the capacity to be able to work through those checks and balances without getting foiled. And so the challenge, I think, in this conference, and I hope in the conversation now, is to find some way to balance these two impulses in a way that allows us to get things done without inviting abuse from centralized authority. And I just hope that that can be a framing device for the conversations that follow. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. David, over to you.
Well, I know that my remit is to talk about American examples of competent government, and I will address that shortly. But as I began thinking about this subject, my mind fixed on a couple of things. One was to take seriously the relation between the two key words in the subtitle for this conference, competent and government. And I dare say that the latter word, government, is often spoken in this building, if it's spoken at all, as some kind of anathema. So I salute the organizers of this gathering for taking the subject head on. For me, there's no better summary, at least in the American canon, of the essential meaning of that word government than what James Madison had to say in Federalist Number 51. He famously said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." So when we talk about government, we must recognize at the outset, we must concede that we're talking about humankind's fallen nature. And we must also realize that a foundational truth, that when we abandon the state of nature where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, to reap the benefits of society, we accept as a necessary part of the bargain that we will cede some measure of individual autonomy to government as the agency that makes society livable. So the trick, as Madison reminds us, is to find the balance point between the government's proper sphere of authority and individual liberties and prerogatives. So I believe, and I think in agreement with Mark, that there is a peculiarly American flavor to the eternal controversy about where to locate that balance. And again, I'll come to that in just a moment. But I'd like just briefly to dwell on the second item that intruded itself on my attention as I thought about this subject and this conference. It's a cultural artifact that's nearly 7 centuries old. It's a set of frescoes in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, Italy, long misattributed to Simone Martini, but now generally acknowledged to be from the hand of his contemporary Ambrogio Lorenzetti. There are 3 frescoes. Many of you in this room may have seen them. 2 represent, respectively, allegories of good and bad government. And the third is the effects of good government. So let's focus mainly on the first 2. Its most important figure is Justice. And she appears surrounded by representations of virtues, like fortitude, prudence, and tellingly, grazing upward to the figure above her is a figure representing wisdom. No less importantly, she sits atop a plaque labeled Concordia, or harmony, from which a cord extends through a procession of citizens, each of whom grasps the cord by hand, not tied or bound by the cord, but voluntarily taking hold of it, which I take to be a reminder that legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed, not simply the submission of the governed, and that legitimate government implies a social contract in which individuals understand that they are willingly self-limiting to some degree in order to reap the benefits of collective life. And if the implication is, among the many implications, is that compromise is essential to orderly social life and to competent, effective government. And those benefits are richly depicted in the fresco showing the effects of good government there in the Palazzo Pubblico, where prosperous citizens engage in mutually beneficial commerce, the arts, and even in one scene, dancing in the streets. Now, for viewers of the frescoes, the lesson is driven home on the opposing wall, where we see the allegory of bad government. There we see crime and filth and disorder and fields and buildings in disrepair, presided over by a cross-eyed, horned, and fanged figure labeled tyranny, and he is surrounded not by virtues but by vices, including avarice, vainglory, and fraud. And above him is not wisdom, but pride, and a plaque that reads, "Because each seeks only his own good." So, what are we to take away from this brief and amateurish excursion into art history? Number one, just a reminder, government, as Mark also reminded us, is a collective enterprise. Secondly, and my argument is that good government is downstream, as it were, from culture, from a recognition by the governed that certain virtues and shared values are essential to the legitimacy and functioning of political authority. And third, that the elements as well as the vulnerabilities and the challenges of good government have been recognized for centuries, if not millennia, and that we do in fact have something to learn from the historical record of serious thinking about these matters. So let's turn to the American case. This audience does not need to be reminded that we as a people have long been wary of government authority. Thomas Jefferson observed in 1787 that there were 3 forms of government. He described the first one as without government, as among our Indians. And then he went on to say, it is a problem not clear in my mind that the first condition, that is no government at all, as among the Indians, he thought, is a problem not clear in my mind that the first condition is not the best, but I believe it to be inconsistent with any great degree of population. And here he foreshadowed a discussion that assumed a great valence and urgency about a century later, as Mark has indicated. Again, more about that in just a moment. And you could cite examples ad infinitum of this notion. Henry David Thoreau, that government is best which governs least, often attributed to Jefferson, it's actually Thoreau. Or Sam Houston, as he left the governorship of Texas, admonished the Texas legislature, govern wisely and as little as possible. And to take a more recent and perhaps more provocative example, Ronald Reagan, in his first inaugural address, declared that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And here we might pause for a moment and ask, and I think this conference will explore the idea of how and why it is, and under what circumstances, that a traditional concern for limited government can edge over into outright hostility that can paralyze government tout court. So let's just briefly visit, as Mark has already done, some historical episodes that might form the basis for further discussion of our subject, competent government. Let's start with the so-called late 19th century Gilded Age. Our esteemed colleague Frank Fukuyama lays heavy emphasis on the 1883 Pendleton Act that created the competitively composed and professionally qualified federal civil service. That transition from the so-called spoils system that had staffed federal offices for the early part of the 19th century, Fukuyama argues, saved the United States system of governance from chronic incompetence and made possible a more or less orderly transition into the modern era. Now, believe me, I have nothing against the federal civil service. My own father was a federal civil servant, and he discharged his duties with a commitment and conscientiousness as if he had taken religious vows. But let me remind you that just 5 years after the Pendleton Act passed, James Bryce, English visitor, sometimes compared with Alexis de Tocqueville for the scope and depth of his analysis of American society, published The American Commonwealth. And one of its most incisive chapters was entitled, "Why the Best Men Do Not Go into Politics." And here we have a reminder that competent government is more than a matter of staffing the agencies with committed and conscientious technocrats. As important as the Pendleton Act was, a more meaningful embrace of competent government came a generation later, in my view, in the much debated progressive era customarily associated with the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And here I take competence to mean the emergence of governmental institutions and practices, and I dare say statutes, commensurate with the complexity and scale of the rapidly industrializing and urbanizing and ethnically diversifying society that was early 20th century America. Examples include the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Federal Trade Commission, the 16th and 17th Amendments to the Constitution, creation of the Federal Reserve System, just to name some conspicuous examples. But I mean something more here, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss it over the course of this conference. What I'm pointing to is the modeling and sustenance by political leadership of the concept that the predicate of competent government is legitimate government, and reciprocally, that among the important guarantors of legitimacy is competence. There's a two-way relationship between the two concepts. And I would claim something similar about the next great round of modernizing government. Mark has already mentioned it, commensurately with the scale, modernizing government commensurately with the scale and complexity and crises of the mid-20th century. I have in mind, of course, the New Deal of the 1930s. Now, again, believe me, I'm not unaware of the persistent controversy about the legitimacy of New Deal initiatives. I was vividly reminded of that last spring, a 4-day symposium in Miami about the New Deal, sponsored by the Liberty Fund, which had something of the flavor of an attempted exorcism. But I think it's defensible to argue that the government that emerged from the New Deal was competent enough not only to build the TVA, but to wage and win a great war, and to build the latticework of reforms that underlay the greatest sustained period of economic growth in the history of the Republic, and underwrote as well a feeling of social comity that facilitated, at long last, a second Reconstruction that brought at least a measure of meaningful fulfillment of the broken promises of emancipation a century earlier. So that brings us to the 1960s and the era of civil rights and the Great Society. It seems to me, and again I think Mark has already hinted at this, that there is something qualitatively and consequentially different about the 1960s, something that distinguishes governance in that era and ever after from the more or less settled legacies of the progressive and New Deal eras. And it's that context that makes understandable, and for his purposes politically useful, President Reagan's dictum that government is the problem. So I will leave it to my colleague Jennifer Burns to dilate on that observation if she chooses. But I will close by citing Robert Putnam's recent book, The Upswing, which locates in the 1960s a truly remarkable convergence in sector after sector of American life of swings away from what might be broadly called communitarian values toward more individualistic, even antisocial values. Among others, Ambrogio Lorenzetti knew something about the implications of such a shift.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening, and thank you to my co-panelists and to Philip for inviting me here today. Philip gave us a few prompts, as you heard. He noted we used to be regarded as having a can-do government that could accomplish many extraordinary things, and asked us panelists to reflect on some questions. Why did we seem to be able to do so much back then? What seems to have changed? And what strengths do we still retain? So I thought I would dig in a little bit in the limited time that I have to this question about what seems to have changed, and focus, as is starting to happen with my co-panelists, on the 1960s. I think that is a key transition moment. So when I think to myself, well, what has happened since the 1960s on this question of competent government? I have to say that much of the narrative I have comes from people in this room, some of it from Dunkelman's book, Why Nothing Works, which offers, if I could condense it into a nutshell, that our Hamiltonian government was overrun by a Jeffersonian concern for individual rights. That's sort of like the Lilliputians tacked down the giant with a million small rules. Or I've also been enlightened by Dan Wang's terrific book, which tells us, in a nutshell, we have too many lawyers. Perhaps we already knew that, but nonetheless, I recommend his analysis of the comparative lawyerliness of the United States to the engineering mindset of China as a quite revelatory distinction to make. But if I'm asking what is my take as I synthesize these, one thing I tend to think about is that we have come into, and maybe started in the 1960s, to come into the maturation of the administrative state, into a different sort of growth phase of it, in which questions arose about its legitimacy. And I think one of the helpful things that Mark Dunkelman's book does is remind us those questions about legitimacy were not simply the province of conservatives or thinkers or activists on the right. There was a very strong critique from the left as well. So it's around the 1960s and then decades after that the broad project of administrative governance begins to lose some of its legitimacy, a sort of slow erosion over time. And in part, it's because the administrative state comes to be seen as a progressive political project, and its fortunes come to be very much tied to that political movement or identity. Which brings me to the question of today, which I think is really most pressing for the conference, is how does the state regain its legitimacy? Could the administrative state be coded or recoded as bipartisan or conservative in a way that would open the door to a new era? And I think that it will have to, in some respect, if it is to survive, to prosper, to be refounded in the wake of the changes of 2025. Now, I think there's a real challenge and an opportunity here, simply because we live in an unprecedented era of public visibility and public feedback. Nothing is hidden anymore. Everyone is out there, everyone is posting, everyone can run their own data and share it quickly. And our institutions are simply not built for that. They're built for a different culture, a culture of deference, a culture of not knowing, a culture of distance between the government and the people that it affects. It is simply not there anymore. So I think there is an opportunity to rethink about how would you design organizations of governance, structures of governance in an era where everyone can see everything, where you cannot lie, you cannot hide, you cannot dissemble as you might have done before. A sort of era of radical transparency. Now, Philip asked us to sort of use history as a learning tool, which, as he knows, is quite a perilous venture. But I will nonetheless throw out some episodes that I think might be important for us to think about. On the question of credibility and how a governing institution might regain it once lost, I think a very informative case study would be the history of the Federal Reserve System. In the 1970s, it suffered from a severe lack of credibility. This was, in fact, one of the drivers of the extended episode of inflation of the 1970s, as people simply did not believe that the Federal Reserve would address the problem in any meaningful way. Now, the institution recovered. Until recently, it was considered politically untouchable, right? Its independence sacrosanct to our prosperity. So what happened? How did the Fed recover its reputation, its public profile? Well, in part, it's a story of political courage, the political courage of Paul Volcker and of Ronald Reagan. In part, it's a story of a clear mandate. The Federal Reserve continued to operate with a dual mandate, but Paul Volcker made it clear that tackling inflation was a priority. And then the Fed learned to operate with more increased transparency, quite a departure from that time of the 1950s when it did what it wanted and answered to no one. It began to draw on research, on a strong body of academic research about what monetary policy could and could not do. And it built research streams into what is still a profoundly political institution with its leadership subject to political authority. And ultimately, it worked. The Federal Reserve was able to staunch the rising tide of inflation and create a relatively stable price level into our own day. So to summarize, expertise was given political cover, which brought it time to work in a limited and targeted field where the government's capacity and its task were very clearly delineated. Now, I could go a little bit deeper and talk about the Fed's shift to more of a rules-based framework over a discretionary framework, and I think that's another potential way to think. The institution regained legitimacy when it communicated why and how it was making decisions and how it would measure those decisions. Now, perhaps as an economic institution with a limited ambit, it has limited applicability more broadly, but I think nonetheless, the recovery of a reputation, the recovery of a reputation for competence, and the recovery of actual competence is an example that commends itself to us. So two other examples I'll just put on the table. One is that has come up recently in discussions of where the federal government is, and this is Operation Warp Speed, a private-public partnership reliant upon a great accumulation of government-funded expertise and research that nonetheless got us a vaccine for COVID-19 in absolutely record time, unthinkable time. And I think this brings us to one of Philip's questions: what strengths do we still retain? Unless we get too pessimistic, I think this is an example of the strengths that we still retain. I would add another one, the 1969 moonshot, an accomplishment that has given as a new vocabulary word, the moonshot, to shoot for the unthinkable and maybe to get there. Now, this was driven, as was Operation Warp Speed, by a sense of crisis. And we all lived through the crisis of the virus, but we have to recall the crisis of the Soviet arms buildup, of the nuclear arms race, the crisis of Sputnik, that the Soviets are outstripping us. This created a similar desire, a similar fear, and a similar willingness to try to move forward in a new and different way. Again, this technological innovation built on decades of federal spending on defense in this case. What is common to both? Both had a crisis, both responded to a crisis, a fast crisis or a slow-moving crisis. This crisis, in turn, brought out a real leadership capacity in both cases. Presidents of the United States identified these as a goal and were able to move quickly, in some cases staking their public reputation on it. Now, what is different? Most clearly is the impact these successes had on the broader society. Try to imagine feeling again the wonder and excitement of the first man to walk on the moon. A whole generation of children wanted to become astronauts because of it. And compare this to the social division we face today over the question of vaccines. So my ending provocation would be, let's keep that moonshot in mind. Let's think about what it would take to do it again. What would our era's moonshot look like? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is a good moment in this transition to the conversation where I want to mention the co-organizers of this conference. I'm actually the representative of the lawyers. I've also worked in government some, and But in a way, with Frank Fukuyama as a co-organizer, we've got someone who has thought broadly about both history and philosophy over a span of thousands of years. An exemplar of timeless wisdom is Frank. But then we also have Jennifer Polka. Jennifer is quintessentially modern. She emerges from, I know her friends probably don't think of her this way, but she emerges from the tech sector. She's part of the cool generation that's and actually emerging out of private success, private tech success, who then confronts the government and throws up her hands and says, can we do better? So in a way, between kind of my linkages to a little bit of both Jeffersonian and Hamiltonianism, and Frank's timeless wisdom, and Jennifer's can-do spirit animated by the reigning culture of the age, I think the co-sponsors of this conference are trying to pull together a pretty broad-ranging conversation about, as Mark put it in the title of his book, Why Nothing Works. I want to add this one thing before transitioning in. And this is very important and really harkens back to what David was saying a few minutes ago. So last week, Hoover held a big fall retreat. You know, we're hundreds of people here, our donors, all that. At that retreat, Condi Rice, our director, announced to these hundreds of people that Hoover is embarking on a major new project, which we're calling the Commons Project. And we had actually a big talkathon at the main dinner of the conference where Condi, Neil Ferguson, and I were on stage. And Condi explained right up front that we're all focused in this Commons Project on what comes next. That is, we think the basic system, the world system, the global commonwealth system that Condi and I worked a little bit to help create at the beginning of the 1990s is gone, is down, and is not coming back. We are currently in a period of turmoil with elevated risk, and the risk trend is rising. And the focus of our institution at this generational moment has to now really turn its attention to what comes next. Not next week, but a little beyond that. The conversation we're having here is part of that. So I just framed that as if it was a world order problem. But what Condi then drew out is what we're seeing across all of the free societies is the challenge of defining, as she put it, a new social contract. Hearkening exactly back to the themes that David was drawing out as he, in turn, did his little excursion into art history. And part of that new social contract, indeed, is whether or not government can work, to borrow Mark's expression. And a point that came out of that discussion, and actually at the very end I was asked a question from the audience, sort of, you know, what can we do? How should we think about this? And actually my answer to that was, look hard at our relationship to the technological transformation. That what happened, we are now in a period of history akin to a period of history over 100 years ago in which the country is being transformed by a transformation. You could call it technological, but of course it was transforming every aspect of society. The urbanization, industrialization, everything else. It's not merely technological. So the premise could be we are actually in another period like that of transformation in a new era of world history on that scale. And as in that period, the success of governance in adapting itself to those changes and indeed being a way of making those changes work for people in reattaining the sense of wonderment that Jennifer so beautifully alluded to, but in a positive way that actually may renew the social contract, could actually be an important theme for us. And in that theme, it's clear that the sheer competence of government in mapping these, in adapting to these transformations is very quickly going to go beyond a lot of the litmus test stereotypes about whether government should do this or that thing. What this is going to mean for the whole future of education, for the whole future of healthcare, for the whole future of defense, and when we could just go on and on. Even for the sense of what it means to be human is going to be really important. So I'd like to invite the panel, all three of you, in a way now to, as historians, and having thought a lot about the way we adapted to these past transformations, to reflect a little bit on kind of when and how society recognized it was going through something that was, that they were in a special era, unlike the eras of the past, and that in deep ways they had to adapt.
Well, my candidate, again, in the American context, would be the so-called progressive era that I think all of us have alluded to. And I think of the work that put the distinction or the relation between Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian constructs into play was Herbert Crowley's famous book of 1909, I believe, The Promise of American Life, in which he talked about the need for Hamiltonian means to Jeffersonian ends. And I think also of Walter Lippmann's famous book, 1914, Drift and Mastery, articulate identification of exactly what you're talking about, that we are living in an era of unprecedented complexity and interdependence, and our organs of governance are not commensurate with that. And we need to create new institutions and new values in order to have a civil society that is livable by all of us together. So that to me was a moment which I think much of the vocabulary and syntax and grammar of modern American politics was first developed, and it hasn't always been effective ever since, but that was a transformative moment, at least conceptually.
Jennifer, Mark, do you have any comment on that?
No, I appreciate that. I think that's an insight. I was thinking even a bit earlier, and less in the, maybe you're talking about the grammar and the syntax as a certain stage of crystallization that then makes it possible for the political system to engage these questions. I myself was thinking more about what is kind of bubbling and inchoate and unorganized. And so if we think of mass immigration as one of the challenges and industrialization, this starts way before 1913, right? And how is it addressed? It's addressed locally. There's a rise of the boss system. There are social movements about temperance. Let's try to change people's lifestyles. There's a variety of societal responses and sort of counter movements to the movement of industrialization that percolate along for a while before they are channeled into the political system. So I think when I think about our own era, I feel that because so many of the new technologies have been deployed for political ends, it's hard for the political system to feel willing to engage them. In other words, if you have built your political career on using social media technologies, why would you do anything to change how they operate if they've benefited you, right? And so I think there's an interplay between now we see ourselves coming into more of a rivalry geopolitically, and so maybe some of the benefits you got from trade are now being reassessed. But I do think we are maybe in an earlier stage than having the syntax. I mean, maybe we're trying to get the syntax here, but I think we're still kind of in that earlier stage of trying to figure out what are the problems and what solutions need to be supercharged by something beyond the sort of spontaneous social processes.
My reaction is, I think you're absolutely right. The central question that we're trying to grapple with here, it seems to me, is who should decide stuff? Just generally. You know, my wife gets home on Friday nights from work and says she doesn't want to cook. And I say to her and to our two daughters, let's go out. And that's great. And everyone's excited. And then we get into the conversation that every parent knows is a complete nightmare, which is where should we actually go to dinner? And my 6-year-old wants donuts for dinner, and my 9-year-old will only eat chicken sandwiches, and my wife wants, unseasoned quinoa or whatever it is that she likes. And the question is, in that moment, how do you get to a decision? That was the problem, essentially, that the Drift and Mastery, that Walter Lippmann, that Herbert Crowley, that a whole variety of people were trying to grapple with at the turn of the 20th century. We had machines and trusts, and they were making decisions that weren't in the interest of society as a whole. And it seemed at that point as if the only answer was to push power up into institutions that would incorporate all of our concerns. Then we get to a point in the 1960s and 70s where it seems like that establishment that we've empowered is actually doing things that are counter to the public interest. And so we put, I think your little Putin example is exactly right. There was discussion of making that the cover art of my book. That is the notion. And so now we're at a point where we're talking about it. Maybe we are in a new stage of world history, but we have this simple question which is yet unanswered. Who should decide stuff? When you've got a bunch of competing priorities, we need to find some way to build a transmission line from clean energy to the place where it will be expended. We need to build a transmission line. Should it go through the pristine forest? So we're choosing between clean energy and using it and bespoiling a beautiful forest. That's like who should decide? And if we can come out of this conference with an answer to that question, I think we'll have succeeded.
Philip,
All right.
Philip, let me just share an anecdote with all of you. I was in China several years ago, and I rode the high-speed rail train from Beijing to Shanghai and back again. And I happened to run into a Chinese friend after I'd come back. And he said, "Where have you been?" I told him I took this high-speed rail down to Shanghai and came back. How was it? I said, it was wonderful. It was antiseptically clean, quiet, hugely efficient, great service on board, 200 miles an hour, the whole trip, 5 hours down, 5 hours back. Wonderful. He said, "Well, why don't you stay in our country and ride some more of our high-speed rail lines? We have 15 of them." I said, "Well, I have to go home tomorrow." He said, "Well, how many high-speed rail lines do you have in your country?" Well, I just give him the honest answer, none. And of course, he said, "Well, how can that be?" I thought, here's a teachable moment. I gave him a little mini lecture on the nature of our whole government system and the DNA, as a phrase you often use, Philip, that underlies it, how we set up a system in the late 18th century where power was difficult to exercise from the center, checks and balances, the federal system, we dispersed decision-making authority in all kinds of ways because we're very wary of rule from the top. And he looked more and more puzzled as I was going on, thinking, well, maybe I'm using the wrong vocabulary and I'm using words he isn't familiar with, or it's too exotic a concept. And then suddenly at some point his face kind of lit up. He said, I understand. The problem is your system. So why don't you change your system? He said, we've changed ours several times in the last 100 years. Why don't you do the same? Well, there's your new social contract on steroids. But it is a systemic problem, is my point.
It's so interesting. Actually, one of the great Chinese political philosophers, Liang Qichao, in the early 20th century, was fascinated by actually the American work, by John Dewey's work, by the work in the Progressive Era. And as time passed, was disappointed. He was very disappointed with the way American political science started developing from his point of view, because it was actually getting away from, the problem-solving mindset that he had admired so much in the early part of the century. All right, let's throw the floor open to your questions. Right there, I see a hand.
My name is Dan Carpenter. I teach government at Harvard. I chair the department, and the Lorenzetti frames are in the chair's office. They've been there for at least 2 or 3 chairs now. I learned a lot from this. I'm taking notes. But there's I think a missing variable, not that you necessarily neglected, but maybe you just didn't have time to include. When I think about the progressive era, and I agree that it's at that moment when whether or not we agree with what the government was doing, we can say that the government was doing that with relative competence. There were European visitors at the time that thought that the Department of Agriculture actually was basically the most efficient and modern administrative organization on the planet, a la, say, 1912, 1915. But if you look at the number of things that spawned off, including the Pure Food and Drugs Act, meat inspection, cooperative extension, all those kinds of things, it was quite remarkable. But there was something else that it was kind of at its nadir at that point, which was public sector unions. And so if you look at the development of American government, I would say that the two of the eras in which a number of you identified as charged with a certain kind of dynamism, right, were also periods during which American public sector unions were at pretty much their weakest in American history post the Pendleton Act. FDR, of course, actively fought against the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. It took a while for public sector workers to unionize after the Pendleton Act, in part because the Pendleton Act itself took a while. And so is one of the, and I'm not necessarily anti-union per se, but there's long been a criticism out there that public sector unions are a little bit different. They have, through the ability to dominate small turnout elections, especially for state, municipal, and local government, an ability to sort of put their hand on the till more so than others. And is it just lawyers that are preventing us from getting things done, or can I bring that up, namely the increasing public sector unionization of the entire American government workforce is at least one contributing factor?
So let me take at least one more question before I kick this back to the panel to comment on, if you have any comments. Anyone else have a question? I may be. Yes, right there in the back.
Thank you.
And you're close to a microphone, too.
Miracles.
You are?
Paul Brophy, just a resident of the area.
Welcome.
Listening to you all talk, what came to mind was Christopher Lash's essay on the revolt of the elites, where he talks about the rise of a meritocratic elite, I guess probably starting in the 60s, that have taken control of, all institutions, from education to industry to government to the foundations to the media. And he talks about he uses the words, I think, ruthlessness, cosmopolitanism, a diminished sense of obligation, and vanishing reservoirs of patriotism. And to the extent that if that is the era we're in now, and we're practically at ground central for exactly those kind of elites, how do you change the country if you have an elite that has a worldview that is different from the large bulk of their fellow citizens?
Okay, why don't we, would any of you like to comment on either of those questions?
I'd say I think the first comment is really worth thinking through. The second comment kind of takes us to higher education and the debates and dilemmas of higher education. And, there's often unintended consequences. I think this meritocratic system was developed to give everybody a chance and to try to bring into higher education not just those already from wealthy families, but those who showed talent across the nation. And one unintended consequence is that we centralized. We tended to take those identified as having talent and pull them out of their local context and centralize them in the great national and even international universities like Stanford. And I think that meant that people didn't necessarily go back. They stayed in the metropole. They didn't go back to the province from whence they came. And you repeat that over generations, and I do think you create a class of leaders who becomes more attuned to a national or an international culture than a local or a federal culture. And that is part of the problem. I'm not sure how to reverse it. I think part of it has to do with strengthening the state university systems. We have just incredible state universities. I'm a graduate of Berkeley. And over time, those have become less funded and less central. And there's been sort of opportunity hoarding by the very top of the educational pyramid. I don't think that's been good, even for those of us at that point. So I think we're all talking here within Stanford more generally about that, and how do you keep what's good and how do you reverse some of what we now see as problematic.
Either of you have?
Well, I'm not sure I have any direct answer to either question, but let me take the opportunity to repeat something I said at the podium, that I think legitimacy of government is the predicate of competence, and competence is a strong guarantor of legitimacy. But you mentioned something you thought was missing from the discussion, was the role of public sector unions. I think there's another element that's been missing so far, and it is quite simply the role of leadership. It just happened, when I was thinking about this, my eye fell on something online, which I'd heard before, but I'd forgotten about it. It's a remark of William Allen White, the sage of Emporia, a great famous journalist in the late 19th, early 20th century. Probably his most famous article was "What's the Matter with Kansas?" a big anti-populist tirade. He met Theodore Roosevelt in 1897, before Roosevelt's president. And he said the following in his memoir. He said, "Roosevelt bit me and I went mad. He sounded in my heart the first trumpet call of the new time that was to be. He poured into my heart such visions, such ideals, such hopes, such a new attitude toward life and patriotism and the meaning of things as I had never dreamed men had." What a powerful voice to inspire people with public service, good government. I haven't heard that kind of voice convincingly and authentically in our culture in many years.
Dan, I'm thrilled that you're in the audience. You're heavily cited in my book, so I want to address your question directly. I am somewhat skeptical about the role of unions being a crucial element here. The story that gives me my skepticism is the story of aided dependent children, the New Deal program, which was the first welfare program nationally, quite like that, which eventually becomes AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and then now TANF. ADC, when it was passed explicitly to keep women out of the professional workforce. It was passed because there was a fear that women who were widows or mothers would be forced to go into the workforce. And the government had some interest in keeping them home to raise children. And the program empowered states to hire what were then a new legion of professional social workers who were designed to go in and to help women in a very matriarchal way learn to live on the straight and narrow. No men, no alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. And they had enormous discretion, these social workers, who were handing out dollars to enhance what a recipient got and to diminish what a recipient got if they were not staying on the straight and narrow. So there was enormous discretion to choose among the social workers, which leads to this regime, which people find very offensive in the 1960s, which is that social workers are going on midnight raids, they called them, where they would knock on a recipient's door at midnight and see whether there was a man in the house. And if there was, it was an indication that they were either being amoral or that they were with a man and therefore should not be on the dole anymore. And this came to be viewed in this new era of new mores, maybe as Christopher Lasch talks about, to be a real oppression. And so in order to stop that discretion that these social workers had, the progressive movement, and broadly speaking, the reform movement, moves to a situation where rather than giving discretion to these social workers to be matriarchs, we move to a system where the people who are running AFDC are essentially just checking boxes. There is an explicit effort to move out of discretion with these government workers to one where they are basically just, how much do you make? How many kids do you have? And you check off the boxes, and your incentive is not to give out money, but it's simply to make sure that you are hitting your marks, so that our sort of generalized impression of caseworkers, as opposed to social workers, caseworkers with these huge piles of files on their desks, not really caring, just trying to sort of get through the day. That is the incompetence that we are now frustrated with. Is that Massachusetts does something interesting in this way, is that they are trying to make this transition from matriarchal social workers who are oppressive to just sort of clerks. They had previously put caseworkers who were in geographic areas together. Cases that were in geographic, even the town of Lowell would have a caseworker who knew all the social service agencies. In order to break that bond, they changed it so that all the cases were given to caseworkers on an alphabetical basis, so they wouldn't know statewide who was where, and they wouldn't be able to have this sort of coercive role. And so the suggestion I took from your question is that having a unionized workforce sort of diminish the quality of the work or change the incentives for the individual workers. Whether the matriarchs who had been social workers had been unionized or not, whether the caseworkers who were incentivized not to give out money or to sort of live and die by the bureaucratic standards were unionized or not, is to me less of a factor than the incentives of what we're trying to do and who should get to decide what an individual recipient gets.
So I'll close with this comment actually to just pick up your question about Chris Lash and the issue of elites. Because there are two dimensions to the problem. The first dimension that's less well understood is that often the problems are elites versus other elites. So for example, in the COVID crisis, there was actually quite a lot of very bad advice given out in the spring and summer of 2020 about how to protect yourself from contagion. You remember the theater, hygienic theater, all that. It turns out some very good work's been done on this. I'll talk some more about this tomorrow. What you had then was guidance issued by a very small self-perpetuating elite of biologists who were significantly influenced by tuberculosis models of disease spread that had been developed in the 1920s, who dominated the giving of that advice in the particular culture that produced that advice. The answer to them was, of course, not to do a poll on how diseases spread. The answer to them, actually, the big contest, which was invisible to the public, came from people who do occupational health for a living. There is a whole other elite of people who do occupational health and safety studies, including for aerosols and workplaces and so forth, who had a totally different view on how to do the health guidance, came from a completely different intellectual tradition. The biologists, by the way, tend to look down on people who do occupational safety and health. The biologists come from Harvard. The occupational safety and health people come from West Virginia University. These are not actually made up illustrations. And so there was almost like these are the blue collar elite in the science world versus the white collar elite. And the white collar elite won and gave terrible advice, which then is revelatory to people who study this sort of thing, but is actually an argument within the elites that was really divorced from the public vision, except that, of course, the elites then destroyed. This is one of 3 or 4 things that destroyed the credibility of elites in 2020 in the crisis that touched more Americans than any other. But then the other comment that's worth making on this question of elites is a deep, deep old question that harkens back to Marx's original discussion of Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian. And an old colleague of mine named Sophie Rosenfeld wrote a book called Common Sense. She's a historian about basically Tom Paine's book. And basically the idea is this seems like a wonderful theme, except when you think about it for a while. You know, you could ask yourself, is common sense always right? Is the vox populi always right? Then you think about that for a while. You think about things that people thought had made common sense at different times in our history, and what people would have done if you just took the polls. And the way I relate to that very personally is once upon a time I was a trial lawyer. I tried cases long ago. And actually a big issue for when you're a trial lawyer is like, okay, do I want to have this case tried to a jury or to a judge? It's really, it poses this most stark form, this jury that's randomly selected from your fellow citizens, or would I rather throw it to this careerist, well-trained judge who's heard many, many cases? It turns out that that's actually a less obvious choice than you might think, oh, well, of course, if the merits are on my side, for sure I want the judge, because the jury is just a bunch of people who can be bamboozled. Their reputed common sense put to one side. To lawyers who have a lot of experience in the courts, it actually is not nearly so clear-cut, especially if you know some of the judges. And actually, that's a deep point, is elites are not this kind of homogeneous blob. The elites are actually just different versions of everybody else. And so then the question of whether you prefer the jury or the judge is this deep question, but partly one that comes back to themes we've brought out here is how do you measure competence? And how do you set up a system in which there is some sense of accountability and transparency and measurement? And David alluded to this, I think, explicitly, and so did in different ways did Mark and Jennifer. And I think like for instance with Jennifer's references to the way the Federal Reserve System evolved and changed, I think those are really powerful framing takeaways for the discussions that we're going to continue tomorrow. For those of you from the general public, we'll be having some private workshops in the morning to compare notes among a lot of really interesting people who've come here. But then in the afternoon, we're going to have 3 more public panels. You'll see the schedule outside. And if you want to hear the way we're developing these ideas some more, come on by tomorrow. Thank you very much for coming on a Sunday.